All right, so we should be on section 2. So go ahead and find coevolution in your notes. And I'm just going to review a little bit here. Since it's been a week since we had class, we opened with natural selection. And we said in natural selection, it's a process by which individuals that have favorable variations and are better adapted to their environment survive to reproduce more successfully. So in order for evolution to occur, members must survive and reproduce. This is how you pass on your genes. And so evolution is defined as a change in the characteristics of a population from one generation to the next. The examples, we gave several, but this was Darwin's finches, and you should have seen that in your lab that you did. Some examples about Darwin's finches. We also talked about, because of our insect collection, we talked about these katydids. We talked about why you never see the hot pink ones, and why we said that was. They don't die, they get eaten. So you can't reproduce if you are eaten before you are able to reproduce. So it is beneficial to be green because it's camouflage. We went over the 4 tenets or premises for evolution by natural selection. You need to know those are in your book. And then we talked about natural selection in a herd of deer where they get sequestered into an area that's cold. The ones with thin fur don't make it because of temperatures. The ones that left the great thick fur resulted in more thick fur in the offspring. And we also talked about how that can cause species to interbreed, and over time, because of geographic isolation, it can cause speciation. So if this happened for thousands and thousands of years, then they could completely be genetically different from the original population of deer that wandered into that mountain pass. We also talked about traits that disappear from a population, like short necks in giraffes. We said that was not advantageous to have a short neck. So adaptations can be either physical, behavioral, or physiological. Like it can be systems like poison or venom. It can be the way something looks, or it can be the way something behaves. And that brings us to coevolution, which is our big topic for today. So coevolution is a process of 2 species. It could be a plant and an animal. It could be an animal and an animal. It could be a plant and a plant, or bacteria or protist or any organism, evolving in response to long-term interactions with each other. Okay, so this is called coevolution. Co means together. Evolution, of course, means a change. And so, can you think of something that has adapted or evolved in response to something else? It needs to be 2 living things. What about coral? Is coral a plant or an animal? It's an animal, but it lives with a plant. What's the plant? Algae. Okay? So coral is an animal that has to have algae in order to live. That's one of the things that's causing me problems is because the algae dies because of rising temperature in the ocean gets too warm, and when algae dies, coral dies. Anything else? What are 2 organisms that have evolved in response to a long-term relationship with one another? No, I'll give you the textbook example. 106 with the video while we're talking about it. The textbook example is the Hawaiian honey creeper, which is a type of bird. It has a long curved beak to reach nectar at the base of a tubular flower. And the flower has a structure that dumps pollen on the bird's head when it gets to the nectar. And so the flower gets a pollination out of this relationship. What does the bird get? Allergies. Right. It's nectar, right? And so the flower evolved with sweet tasting, nutritious nectar and a structure to pollinate to satisfy the bird's need, and then the bird has the long tubular shaped beak so that it can only feed on that particular type of flower. What?
Like cows and flies.
Cows and what?
Flies.
And flies? How so? You have to explain.
Don't like flies.
What's beneficial to the cow about that?
No, it's not.
It has to be beneficial to both.
The flies eat the blood from the cows, and the cows. No, wait, maybe it's a bird from it.
It is a bird. You're talking about an
yeah.
oxpecker. Yes. So that's a behavioral change. Yes. They eat the flies, not the flies, and the flies eat the cow. So, we'll talk about that one later. The oxpecker, that's a symbiotic relationship. So you can kind of look at coevolution as symbiosis to some extent. But the oxpecker is a little bit more salacious than that. If you can't find any flies, you'll actually peck a hole in the cow and drink its blood. So it teeters the line of parasitism and mentalism. We'll talk about those in later section. Sharks and remoras. Yeah.
The whales and the fish that eat the water.
The whales and the fish that eat the what? The barnacle. Is there a fish that eats the barnacle?
I know, it's something that
I don't think they eat the barnacle. I don't think that's, there's a relationship there, but I don't think it's barnacles. Barnacles are pretty rough to get off. This is the honey creeper right here. And if you'll notice, there's several different species of honey creeper, and they are all specific to one flower. Okay? So that beak right there will only fit in one type of flower. So the adaptation to the honey creeper is a long curved beak. And then the plant has two coevolution adaptations. First is the sweet nectar, and the second is a flower structure that forces pollen onto the top of the bird's head so that when he goes to the next flower, he pollinates it. Now this can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. If you can only bring nectar from one flower, what happens if something happens to the flower? You die. And if the flower can only be pollinated by one bird, what happens to the flower if something happens to the bird? It dies.
Is that why we have bees?
Well, bees are actually introduced to North America. They're from Europe. They're European honeybees is what they're called. So the honeybee that we know about, that we are always going on about, is actually from Europe. It's actually a misnomer to say that if the bees die, we will die, because the bees only got here in 1813, I believe.
So we can get rid of bees.
No, it was 1713. 1713. Well, we can't get rid of them. We shouldn't get rid of them. But there's always something that fills the niche. You know, flies can pollinate plants too. It's just that we like the bees. We brought them over here because they produce honey. See, in Europe there was no sugar cane. No sugar. Can you imagine a world without sugar? That was what they lived in Europe. They had honey. That was it. The sugar cane comes from tropical areas. They can also get beet sugar from sugar beets. But I don't know if they knew that back then or not. I don't know. We'll look up what beet sugar honey cane we use. So, you see coevolution a lot of times in places where there's high competition, like the tropical rainforest, because there's so many plants and so many animals, they develop these co-evolved relationships so that they can make sure that they get pollinated, or they can make sure that they get food and don't have to compete so heavily. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. All right, then, the next type of evolution is artificial selection. And when we watched our video the other day, you saw that cruciferous vegetables, which are like kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, and broccoli, all come from the same original parent plant. So chances are, if you don't like one of those, you probably don't like any of them. Is that true? Well, cucumbers are pickles. But these plants are all related. Probably cauliflower is the least strong tasting of the bunch, but they're all related. And they're all really good for you. They contain antioxidants that fight cancer. So if you can't stand them, I got a tip for you. Go
That's only bacon.
Bacon,
But then I just eat the bacon.
but the bacon's not good for you. The cauliflower and stuff is good for you, so you can't stand to eat your broccoli and your, stuff like that, just cook it with bacon, bacon is better. But you do need to eat a high percentage of those cruciferous vegetables. Lettuce doesn't have nearly the, good stuff in it as cabbage and broccoli, kale. Kale is actually wonderful with bacon grease. Pretty daggone good. Purple what?
The red cabbage,
It's good for you too.
it's so bad.
No, it's not. If you cook things right, they're edible. I didn't used to think a lot of things were good too until I started trying to learn how to cook. You can make anything taste good. With enough good tasting things added to it. You can even eat Brussels sprouts. I hated Brussels sprouts, but now I know how to cook them. All right, so let's talk a little bit about artificial selection in animals. Probably the number one that you're most familiar with is dogs. And all dogs are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So yes, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are the same species, and given the right circumstances, could have offspring. So if you were to do it in a lab, because obviously there's a size difference there, you could still get a mixed breed dog out of a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. We breed dogs for specific characteristics that we like in dogs, like hunting ability, or herding ability, or not shedding, or being intelligent. So let's talk about a few dog breeds that we know of. We have a Great Pyrenees in my house. She's like a polar bear with razor sharp claws and really thick fur, and she's huge. She weighs like 120 pounds, and she's to protect our goats from coyotes, and she does it well. If she jumps up on you, you're going to get touched. So I always go out and go in wearing clothing that her paws won't scratch me with. She herds instinctively. We didn't teach her how to herd. If a goat gets out, she will chase it back in with a pin. That's what she does.
My dog likes this being hypoallergenic.
Hypoallergenic. That's a good thing to breed for, though, because if you have allergies on a dog, you can have it. Anybody else got a dog that's bred for something specific? Big giveaway. It is totally okay to have a regular mutt because they're bred for companionship. Dogs learned a long time ago that it's beneficial to be man's best friend because they get to eat the scraps. So you might even say that that was a type of artificial selection because people took care of the friendly dogs and allowed them to interbreed, and they probably killed the unfriendly dogs. I mean, if I had an unfriendly dog that was hanging around me, I probably would do something about it, especially if I was like a person who lived a long time ago, because it was a threat, right? What else? You got bit in the eye by a dog. What were you doing to it?
Nothing, I was little, I was just standing there and I jumped up and did it.
It might have been an accident.
Oh.
What about
It's not like I
labradoodles?
almost killed her or anything.
Labradoodles are really popular right now. A lot of people like labradoodles.
They're curling.
Well, they're cute,
Don't they
but
not shed?
they don't shed.
Yeah.
And they're really intelligent because labs are intelligent and poodles are intelligent. And so, a smart dog that doesn't get hair all over your house. And it looks like a teddy bear.
And it's big.
It's big. So, I don't understand what's going on with Chihuahuas. They have horrible personalities. Evidently, people just like them because they can hold them in their hand. But it's like having a tiny attack rat. So.
Yeah.
And a big pit bull.
Pit bulls,
The Chihuahua, they're adorable.
they are pit bull behavior. Actually, most pit bulls that I have run into, unless they're taught to fight, are really docile and sweet dogs. They just have a big mouth.
I love
She'll wag her tail.
Oh no, it's like literally right here.
Alright, so we've bred dogs for certain characteristics. We've also bred fruits and grains and vegetables for certain characteristics. And that's how we got the sweetest fruits. Instead of the nasty little strawberries that grow in the yard, we've got the big, fat, juicy, sweet strawberries. Instead of having corn that had, this many kernels, this is what corn looks like today. It's a big improvement, don't you think? But that took time. It took thousands and thousands of years. And so it's not like you can, um, make a change overnight. They still are working on changes though. Every once in a while you'll get a new fruit that ends up at the supermarket like cotton candy grapes or something like that. You say grapes? They're super sweet grapes.
I just see a bunch of different kinds of apples all the time.
They have a grapple that tastes like grapes, an apple that tastes like grapes.
There's two spiders on right here, one there and then one up there.
They won't eat much.
It's so weird.
So one of the biggest problems with evolution for us is resistance in our pest species. It could be insects, it could be bacteria, it could be worms and goats. And since I raise goats, I'll speak to you from that perspective as a farmer that has goats. But resistance is the ability of an organism to tolerate a chemical or disease-causing agent because it contains a gene that can allow it to break down chemicals into harmless substances. So we raise dairy goats. And up until this year, we haven't had a problem with worms, but a lot of people do. We've been using a natural wormer called Sericea lespedeza, which is a plant. And I could buy it in pelletized form over at the Manchester Feed Center. I just fed it to my goats, and then we didn't have a problem with this worm called Barber pole worm. This worm is a tiny little worm. It's like probably a quarter of an inch long. It lives in the goat's intestine and it sucks blood. Okay? It's resistant to almost every chemical wormer out there, but it wasn't resistant to this plant. It kept it under control. Since COVID-19 hit, I can't get a hold of the plant. I've lost 4 goats this year to barber pole worm. And I've used the chemical wormers. So what happens is the load in the goat gets so heavy that they start to get edema, which causes their chins to swell up. It's called ball jaw. So their face gets really, really fat. So you can go in and you can give them a chemical agent, which will kill most of the worms, but not all of them. And it leaves behind just a few. And what do those few worms do? They breed, right? They pass on their genetics.
No, the word they're like, you can deal with it, but
They're immune.
They're immune. There we go. So those worms breed, and then they drop eggs out the goats behind and poop. Well, the goat is meant to eat sticks and twigs and trees and bushes, but most farmers around here don't have enough, so we feed them hay off the ground or we let them graze in pasture. So when they eat, they pick up the eggs of these really resistant worms and they get reinfested. So we start the process over again. I have to give them a chemical worm. This time, more of those worms are genetically resistant to the pesticide that I give them. And I can only give the goat so much because if I give too high a dose, what happens to the goat? It dies. And so it's a fine line, and farmers have a really hard time controlling pests. We don't have such an intimate relationship with that because we can just give our dog a wormer like once a year and it's probably going to be okay. But if you had like a farm with 100 dogs, then pests would be a problem because you've got such a good feeding ground for that pest. Same as like with a garden. You might be able to put poison on your garden because you've got a small plot of land with a few different types of vegetables. But if you're a farmer that has 1,500 acres of soybeans, if you get a pest in there, like a fungus or a bacteria or an insect that eats that particular crop, you stand to lose all 1,500 acres of it. Same with goats. I have a large herd. If resistant worms get into my herd, I stand to lose all of my goats. The weakest ones usually go first, which are the babies and the old ones. So I lost 1 old one and 2 babies, and I've currently got 2. They're in the sick pen. So it's not doing very good. Humans promote the evolution of resistant populations by trying to control pests and bacteria with chemicals. So we up the dose, kills a greater percentage, leaves behind the superbugs. This is a superbug right here. And then they breed and produce super offspring. So pesticides sprayed in corn to kill grasshoppers. They kill most of the grasshoppers. grasshoppers, but it leaves behind a few that have that gene that protects them from the pesticide. And they pass that resistant gene on to their offspring. Every time you spray the corn, more resistant grasshoppers get in the population, so eventually the pesticide doesn't work at all, or we have to use such a high dose of it hurt us for the animal for the crop. So this is called resistance. And we find this all the time. And y'all don't really think about it because you just go to the grocery store and you pick up your fruits and your vegetables and your meat. But for farmers, this is probably the number one thing that costs them money, starting to control pests. And this is just a graphic of that situation. So, we have a quiz. If you will open your Chromebook, go to the Google Classroom. Mr. Wright, I will put up the code for you real quick. I think. Maybe I will. Where's the daggum code? All right. So if you'll go to Google Classroom and put that in, it should enroll you in it. All right, so you should be doing the chapter 4.2 quiz on evolution. You may use your book and your notes. Should have a butterfly on it.